I'm going to lead a little bit the discussion today, but please feel free to jump in whenever to take lead of the conversation. So for today, we were listening a podcast.
Oh, wait, Michael, sorry. I muted everybody so that we wouldn't have any background noise, and that included you. I'm so sorry. Continue. You're good now. Sorry.
Should I start again? I'm not sure.
Yeah, back up just start again.
I'm just going to start again. So hello, everybody. I'm Michael from the American University of Paris. I'm the User Services Librarian at the American University in Paris. And so I have the pleasure to talk about the podcast today with you. And I hope you're all going to have lots of comments about the podcast. It was a very short one. It was entitled How to Find Inspiration, Swipe Right for Professional Digital, and then I can't read it anymore, by Michael Hernandez. And he is interviewing a marketing professor, Aitsen Zhang, and she's talking about the power of social media and other online channels to find your tribe and the resources you need to make change possible. So when she's saying change, I think I understood that she's talking about change within your instruction, in your education, how to teach to students. And she's reporting out from one key moment actually that she had lived when one student wrote in an assessment report that she learned more from an interview with a professional person than from reading or taking a course with her. And that made her really think about her own teaching and her own instruction, and she thought that she might have to change something. It's a very short, it's like 50 minutes, the podcast, and I was wondering maybe some first reactions, what kind of ideas, aspects of that podcast stroke people. Did they have anything they were surprised, or was it something that they were not surprised? Any first reactions on that? Or how did you like it, the podcast and what she's saying, Addison?
I can't stay out of this.
You can stay out of this?
Can I start?
Sure, go ahead.
I was surprised that still now someone was talking about teachers and students being uncomfortable letting their social media and their learning overlap, because my students do that, and they welcome it, they invite it. Like, they like to use Instagram in their projects, they like to use Twitter. So I was a little surprised that conversation was still out there, but I also have to remind ourselves that the people that I'm looking at right now, we're the explorers and the pioneers sometimes. So I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good point, Frank. I was a little surprised by that too. Although on the other hand, not surprised at all. I don't know. It's weird. Like I think that students that I've interacted with, like sometimes they don't see what they're doing on social media as like information gathering or like research. It feels like it's entertaining or just like scrolling through or whatever. And it's like in unpacking what actually you're scrolling past or interacting with, it's like, no, that's actually like you're engaging with these big ideas or like people, like professionals or whatever. So I don't know, maybe it's like a perception thing. And I don't know if it's important to perceive what you're doing on social media as professional or not, but yeah, that's a good, that didn't stick out to me, but you bringing that up, that's a good point. Yeah,
because there was a time in show when my students would have been like, oh no, don't cross that line. We don't do Facebook in class. We don't do, but that seems to have dissolved into a more kind of fluid thing.
I wonder if to some extent, like if you think about, like all of us are of the generation that we were introduced to social media, probably at least in our college years, if not later. And it took a really long time for that to become less of a social thing and more of a like crossover into work kind of thing. Like I remember like when I first set up a Twitter account, I was not thinking about it as a professional thing at all. And I thought at the time, this was in like 2007 or 6 or something, I was like, oh, well, if I start using Twitter for professional reasons, then I'll create a professional account later. And now we really don't manage the two. It's kind of all the same, but it took a while for that to happen. I also wonder if in Korea, the climate is different because social media use in Asia, even in different countries in Asia, is much different. So that's something to think about too.
I have to say that I'm not using Twitter, so I'm still maybe like the old school person. I'm not doing this kind of social media thing too much. I use my WhatsApp. So I saw the power, like when I listened to that, I saw the power what she's talking about to leverage your social media to connect to others. I didn't, yeah, I was, yeah, but I was not, yeah, I don't know how to say that. I was not too, for me, that would be kind of something normal almost, like not something extraordinary. So I'm not sure, what do you think about that?
Michael, that's one of the things that I thought was really interesting is that I felt like she was trying to get at something at like ubiquitous learning, how it's changed. So she said things like the sage on the stage is over, like things that we all know that we've talked about in the past, but she was kind of getting at there's something fundamentally different about what she's doing with social media, how it like revolutionized kind of like literally like changes in a profound way the way that she does teaching and learning in her classroom. And she had, and I was trying to look for it, those 3 C's that she talked about where the 3C system, where she was saying, you know, you build community, contribute, where you're making meaningful comments and, you know, really being thoughtful and purposeful about who you're connecting with and making sure that you're connecting with them, and then creating. And so I thought that was an important point about what she was doing. And I thought it was interesting. I thought a master class, you know, those courses that they have. The other really important thing I thought that she mentioned was the use of mentors or people who are, you know, doing the work in the field and connecting with them as part of the educational experience. And so her role shifted, I thought, if you think about it, it seems pretty mundane at first, but then, you know, or to people, you know, who do this kind of work all the time, but really in a profound way.
In a way, yeah. Go ahead.
I was just gonna give a couple of general reactions. I mean, I wasn't as surprised, I guess, from the notion that, you know, this was sort of new as other people were, just because I think that there's a really wide spectrum and people are all sort of entering at very different points, and it still is relatively new stuff. And to Sam's point, actually, I had to double check and look when I got on Twitter, but it was like 2009, and I delayed. I think it took me about 1.5 years because I just thought it was stupid. And it wasn't until there was some kind of professional connection or whatever that I was like, oh, right, okay, I could actually use this thing. And it was because there was a conference that was happening that I couldn't attend, and I discovered that I could pretty much follow what was happening at that conference from a distance, even though there were no like live video feeds or anything. And then I was like, okay, I think I can figure out how to use this pretty well. So I do think, though, that there's still a sort of disconnect. And I mean, I work at the secondary level, so I work with high school kids, and I've been saying for at least 10 years that you got to expand where you're looking for resources, that when you do research, like you have to open up. And yeah, you can use social media. You have to use it more judiciously. You have to be more thoughtful about it, but there's plenty of stuff, you know, that you can go find. And one of the earliest successes that I had with a few students was you know, they didn't necessarily know where to look. And I would sort of say, okay, well, what's the topic that you're working on? And one of them was working on like neuroscience or something. And I said, well, I don't really know a lot about neuroscience, but I know that this guy writes about neuroscience all the time, and he's got a website, and why don't you go email him and find him? And that guy was willing to like talk with one of my students on the phone for about 45 minutes, you know, and this was like 10 years ago. And then I had another student that, you know, was really interested in marine biology, and they ended up like getting a bunch of YouTube videos by a marine biologist at some university down in the southern United States. And that his YouTube channel was entirely just dives that he would go on, that he would narrate like while he was going on. And I was like, well, that's the next best thing to actually talking to the guy. So, you know, like, but that was really radical at that time. And I still think that a lot of my colleagues would be very, very nervous about doing those kinds of things. But that's almost commonplace now in a way.
I think this is actually fantastic, like that potential of the social media right here, like to connect to experts. I very much agree with you. And I always encourage also my students when they do research to dare like to connect like to those academics in the field, and to show them that they're serious about the research, and to ask for a conversation like you're just saying, Fred. I think this is really fantastic, and there's a huge potential. At this same, yeah, that's like really like what I see. Coming back also like to Fawn about the sage on the stage, I have the feeling that this is what she's talking about, that this is also something that somehow is almost commonplace, like in the United States. I'm not sure. I'm very generalizing, so please limit me right here.
Can I jump in here for a second?
Yeah, sure, Michelle.
Fred, what you just said, I'm in a high school too, I'm secondary too. And it's what you're saying, it's making me think about like very common online safety messages that kids in K-12 will get. Like, don't friend anyone that you don't know in real life, and how counter to what you're describing that is. Because yeah, like someone's an expert, like maybe that feels different than some like, I don't know, some like unknown 15-year-old somewhere or something. But like how like what professionals do online is not, it's not welcomed, or like kids don't get messaging that leads them there in school. And how that's, I get it, it's complicated, but I don't know how commonplace it really is in K-12 because of these mixed messages.
Michelle, oh, sorry, yeah. Go ahead.
No,
I was going to say big yes to Michelle. I had something else to say, but I want to jump on that because my husband and I were just looking at our niece's first YouTube video, and we're all concerned because she's giving too much information. And they're really like this development of where do you share personal information? Whom do you connect with? You know, like when you talk about a stranger, when is it okay to connect with strangers? When is it not? On which platforms? You know, LinkedIn, sure. On Facebook, I don't know. Or on Insta, you know, so this whole navigating this. And I think to also return to the point of people come in at different entry points, I really felt that this podcast was giving various different entry points for various different skills. And so some things that we might take for granted, someone else is like, how do I even navigate this? And so I thought that podcast was very helpful in that regard as well.
Yes, Stevena.
I guess it's also about context, right? So we kind of bring in techno-panics when we're talking about younger children, but then when they are older, say college-going or university-going students, it sort of shifts dramatically. Like what I think, was it Wesley or was it Fred who was mentioning it, where social media was used to research and connect with people. So I've had similar experiences as well, where I have done it, or for a brief period of time when I was teaching, my students have done it. In fact, I was at a conference and I met this person from Turkey who teaches social media marketing to his students, and he said that I had to, I was not on Instagram, but I had to get on Instagram because of my course, and not just to learn how it works, the platform, but also my students came to me and said to me, can you please call influencers from our city to come do some guest sessions, because we would like to be influencers, or we would like to understand how influencers work. And I mean, I guess, yeah, it's all contextual, I suppose.
But I think what's here very interesting is it's when you talk like to an influencer and you want to learn about that, Davina, I think it's really like about the authentic thing. You see, like you reach out really like to a real person. I think which I always, as an instructor, I would always push students to look for, like to that kind of authentic things. And so that's something that, and I see, but Michelle, I see your point, of course, like when you have like the high school students, or like they don't know too much about who to connect to, so that there's kind of a danger, if I understood correctly. So you really have to make like a difference right here, you see. So but I wanted to talk more about also like about the stage on this, the sage on the stage, you see, because Fawn, you were like talking as well, like about the fact that there's a shift. I have the feeling that this shift has happened already in many American universities. I believe that in the United States, which is a huge country, that this is not always, it's very active like the United States, how you teach. In Europe, it's more like the sage on the stage, or you would have like some person like talking for an hour and a half, 2 hours, and you need lots of coffee to follow. So in a way, when I listened to the podcast, I said to myself, this is already happening in the American institutions, but I might be wrong right here. So that's something.
Hey, Michael.
Yes, Renee, I listen to you.
Sorry to interrupt.
Interrupt me.
You have the beautiful limited perspective of European thinking. Oh, it's only the lecturing is only the medieval tradition carried on in ancient universities, and the modern America does it differently. Lecturing is normative in universities.
It's still like the, because you see, whenever I come to United States for like an online training, or not online training, but whenever I come for training to United States, I went to the immersion programs. I went to the digital, like to your summer institute. I always had the thing that there's lots of communication, there's lots of energy coming in, and so then coming back to Europe, I always have the feeling that it's very calm, like on the audience side. So for me, like the sage on the stage, I experienced it like in Europe, but I did not have that. So that's always like my impression, and that's the reason why I said America is a huge country, of course. So it's
you know, what I think is interesting too about all of that is Dr. I said she felt like she had to do it. She had to participate in it in order to really engage her students. And I'm working on a project that I did a couple years ago. I'm going back through data of using, they didn't have to use social media, but they had to use an interactive digital media in a high school classroom to present something essential about themselves while they were looking at how they used technology from different perspectives. And the teacher was like, I don't use this stuff, so I don't really understand how it works, but I know that my students use it all the time. And who made the point that sometimes students don't see that the learning that happens around them all the time is really what they're doing, is engaging in the learning process. And so I thought it was significant that she said, I had to do it myself in order to transform my teaching. I had to engage in it in order to really understand how to maybe facilitate that process for my students.
That was actually my biggest takeaway from this, which I didn't want to dominate when I was talking last time, but like this idea that in order to be a better teacher, you have to also be a practitioner in some capacity, which there's all kinds of reasons why things get in the way, or you can drift away from actually practicing those very things that you're teaching students about at any level, right? Because there's just so many demands being placed on you as the teacher, and you only have so much time. But to me, that was like the linchpin of the whole piece, was that it was the student review that made her see that she needed to re-engage, that like it wasn't, I mean, even the sage on the stage thing, which, you know, like we've talked about, but like it was that she needed to be more than that. And then this other thing, which like sort of seeped into the conversation, I thought, which is something I've been thinking about a lot for the last few years. I don't really know how to solve the problem, but I do feel like one of the things that she seems to have successfully done is to recognize that building a community and extending that sort of learning network actually is an advantage to her students, because in a sense, what she's doing is almost building an audience for her students as they work through these things as well. And I think as a teacher, like building an audience for student work has really profound implications. I think it's really difficult. I don't exactly know how to do it, but I think that it could be really, really powerful.
If I can build off of what Fred said, this conversation is making me think of this passage in this book, the Ethics of Digital Literacy, this meditation from Sarah Kodger. She says, the choice of a teacher to avoid crafting an intentional digital identity costs students the opportunity to view that teacher as a learner in action. And she's actually saying that, like, if a teacher does not, an educator does not engage in this like more public facing audience building activity on social media, then it's your students can't learn how to do that either. And that really pushed me to think, because I mean, actually, Renee, your class last year got me active on Twitter, and I'm so happy that it did, because I had signed up for Twitter like 10 years ago. I never really use it, and then I was forced to in the class, and it's legit led to opportunities, like so many opportunities and connections. And like, I don't really think many of my coworkers at my school use Twitter. And just thinking about, okay, then like, what are the students coming out of my school? Like, what's their relationship to social media? And I don't know. I don't know if I totally co-sign on this idea that educators must engage in this work, but I don't know. I've been thinking about it ever since.
Yeah, I want to try to connect the dots between Fred and Michelle, and because I agree with that whole line of argument. I try to put that into practice as a practitioner myself, but I was once confronted by a colleague of mine who I respect a lot, who said, Renee, by you drawing these bright lines and say teachers have to participate in social media, and teachers have to make their work public, and teachers have to, you know, blah, 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 blah. He says, it's essentially coercive. It's like faculty should be free to accept or reject social media in their lives, and they shouldn't feel coerced into having a public presence if they don't want to have a public presence. And I certainly want to respect faculty's right to reject social media if they perceive it to be harmful or disadvantageous or just a waste of time. So I don't want to limit human freedom in any way. And I think in some ways that was my annoyance with Professor I, right? Which is, she took a story, like, this is true for me, and it's a story, it's a good story for her, and she generalized out like that the whole world should do it this way. And I feel like that does not, I don't think that has the intellectual humility of where we need to be on this topic, which is speaking in the first person and not trying to make claims that are true for everybody all the time.
No, but see, a lot of schools here in India, when they go for campus placements, they sort of want students to have a LinkedIn profile. Sometimes they encourage students to have a unique CV, like a video CV, for instance. And if especially you're looking for a job in digital social media or something that's even remotely connected to applications like Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Snapchat, etc., they sort of want you to have a profile to begin with. So if you're in that position where you are mentoring those students, or you're teaching them a particular subject, shouldn't it be a given that you should be on platforms as well?
Well, Davina, that has to do with whether you're teaching media as a professional field for people to go into for a career, or if you're teaching it as a liberal art, right? And so I think we differ in our sense of like, why are you teaching people media, right? I'm not teaching students to become media professionals. I'm teaching them to become human beings. But I think I might feel more pressure. I feel more coerced to participate in social media if I was training them for careers. And that tension is a very significant tension in the university world. And it's kind of weird that it's kind of going down to K-12 too.
I wonder, though, I want to push back a little bit on everybody. Part of what Dr. I said too was that so again, to go back to some of the kind of background, I think social media tends to be that front piece. And she talked about the mentors, right? So connecting people with mentors and encouraging them to reach out to the mentors and to, start those conversations. But she also talked about some of the other work that she did, that she was working on, where she was including project-based learning, and there was a travel piece, and there were all of these things that were also offline learning experiences, and that this was just one of the ways that connected. So I wonder if in the way that she expressed it, we're missing that part of how it changed her teaching, but we're placing a lot of emphasis on the social media part. So like that project that I talked about was a secondary high school project, but we didn't require them to use social media. The teacher didn't use social media, but a lot of the students chose to use it for their project and began to see it a little bit differently. So I think that's another part of what she was looking at, was this kind of meaningful engagement, like really being purposeful about how we engage and for what reasons, and those kinds of things.
So I have a question for all the teachers right now. Would you be okay with you talking about a certain subject and students with their laptops or with their phones Googling stuff right when you're teaching?
I'm absolutely comfortable with that. I like to work in labs where every student has a computer to work on, because I teach media writing and I teach digital media. I want them to be engaged in it. In fact, I love it because it means they're curious. It means they're actually going to get information and try to expand their knowledge beyond what I'm talking about. So yeah, I love that. And I also want to address what Renee said earlier, and I agree. I think we all make choices about how we're going to engage. For example, I don't love to be public on social media, so I'll do social media for clients because I do digital, but not for myself. And very recently, in the past few months, I've created a Twitter account for my podcast, and now all of a sudden I'm getting a little more active, but it's again a professional front. It's not me, but I have the experience with it to be able to talk to my students about it. Rather than having no experience. And I think Reddit is another good example. I have zero action on Reddit. I am not engaging, but I'm looking at it and I'm paying attention to what's going on so that I can talk about it with my students. But it's true. I think it's everybody's personal choice. My hope is that if we're going to teach something, that we're at least becoming familiar with it.
Here's how I would frame this. I'm totally in support of a learning culture that is invitational and celebratory when it comes to trying new things and encouraging and supporting teachers to take risks and to be stretched and to go further. I think we need to continue to tell our stories about how we have had a transformative experience. I put one into the chat where my wife was doing a coding class for second and third graders 2 weeks ago. They found a TEDx talk by at that time 12-year-old kid who got apps on the store. She tweeted to say, "Hey, we loved your TED talk." He said, "Hey, can I talk to you? Can I help you?" 2 days later, he's now taken a year off or whatever, taking time off from Georgia Tech. He's 22. He has a company in Silicon Valley, and he was talking to these second, third graders saying, "Yeah, I was your age when I got my first app ideas." I mean, that is transformative. I don't think that's normal. I really think those kind of things are rare. Alan Levine is one guy. He's Cogdog on Twitter, if you all don't follow him, who's done some like amazing stories of social sharing, because he really wants to help encourage teachers through stories and personal, kind of like testimony almost, like here, put your toe in the water. You can have good experiences with this. But I think that nudging is good in terms of encouragement. I personally kind of regret that as a tech director at our school for 4 years, I didn't take a more active role in trying to really, because we've got a handful of folks. We got, 150 full-time and part-time faculty and staff. We got a handful on Twitter. But for me, coming into the independent school world, I didn't know how much of my connected educator self I could safely bring. And navigating the culture of our communications department and people who have some very different perspectives and experiences too with social media, it's very challenging. So I agree with Renee. We want to be very careful when we paint with a broad brush. And if we're going, even when we're teachers and we have that coercive power to say, you will do this, I think we want to be very, very careful. But I definitely think celebrating and inviting and then telling the stories of, wow, look at what these, because when the kids are on fire with excitement and then that happened because of a connection you had, I think that people pay attention to that, and those can be really, potentially beneficial stories to tell. But it's a journey, right? We're all on a journey, and the tools are so dynamic that if you make a statement today that's a definitive, you better watch out, because, tomorrow or next week, things are going to change in a big way, or they could.
I really like the way that you phrase that, Wes, and it makes me think that, like, to me, what social media and Twitter allows me to do is demonstrate curiosity or pursue curiosity. And I want every educator to be able to do that and to demonstrate that to students. That does not need to be through Twitter or any social media. It just so happens that in 2020, a lot of it does happen through these social sharing sites. Be that as it may, in 10 years, who knows what's going to be the platform of choice. But yeah, sharing stories and pursuing curiosity, like however you do that, just show your students how to do that, because that is such a gift and so important.
Let's not forget that she taught marketing too. So that kind of caters a little bit.
That's true. You see, but I was wondering, you can use Twitter, you can use Facebook in a way, but then I said to myself, she must be overwhelmed with whatever she's doing, you see, with all that social media, you see, and in a way you have to make a choice. And apparently she's the 3 C's that she mentioned, to connect, to contribute, and to create this contribution, to make a meaningful contribution. I said to myself, she's going to spend hours a day, looking at her social media. And I was wondering how she's doing that. I would be overwhelmed, you see. So in a way, also she was talking at the end about her projects that she's creating, having 1,000 students interviewed. And I was saying to myself, this is just huge. So
yeah, and Michael, I think it's a really good point you raised about the cost benefit ratio that people have to make. The other day, Joyce Valenza at Rutgers University was Joyce Valenza has a giant footprint on social media. She has thousands and tens of thousands of followers, right? And she basically was told by her university that doesn't count for anything, right? Because only scholarly peer-reviewed articles count. And I thought, wow, that is so whacked out. And I feel again, this issue of do you use the internal reward benefit systems for what feels right for you? Do you align it with your mission if you're an activist, or if you see yourself being a public person? Or do you use the metrics of your institution, which tell you how you should allocate your time? So a lot of tensions going on in people's decisions to allocate energy to social media.
I think of it as an investment, because we all have so little time, and it's an attention economy. So the decision to invest in a platform, and it just, what a distractible age we live in, right? Never before have people been so able to be distracted. But the other thing I would frame this with is by talking about the predominant tools through which we are communicated to and we communicate to others, because I think that you know, we used to use papyrus, we used to use scrolls, you know, people used to drive horses and buggies. Some people still do, but I think that part of our conversation needs to be about relevance and literacy and the way that literacy is always changing. And if we absolutely refuse to adopt any new communication modalities, then we risk irrelevance at some level for the present and the future. I am passionate about that, man. I mean,
don't know what to say.
This is recorded.
It is recorded. Yeah,
I'll share this. Our English department at our school for high school currently prohibits students from using any web resources and tells them that they will receive an F if they are caught reading things that another person online has said about Beowulf or about any of these other things. It's a challenging thing. And my daughter is a junior, and so she just had this class last year. So we have cultures in schools that are very antagonistic towards the ideas that I think our Media Club is about, which is let's learn together, you know, how we can survive and thrive in this really challenging environment. That is a pretty shocking thing. So even if you have connections and skills, like being in a culture where norms are so different, school culture is hard to change.
This reminds me of Heather's dissertation. Will you describe it?
My dissertation? I'm not sure what you're referring to.
So Wesley just shared this great story of how the English department in his daughter's school doesn't let them use the internet.
Oh, okay.
And you, I think, did a study of New Hampshire English teachers, and tell us a little bit about what you found.
I don't. I didn't do a study, but we use the internet often. I'm not sure. Yeah, it's daily used in class. All of our students have Chromebooks and have them at the ready, and it varies from class to class what we are engaging in with that.
Oh, I know. I'm thinking of your colleague who used to be at Concord High School. What's her name? Christine Oscar Poisson.
Oh, okay.
I get you guys confused sometimes. I apologize.
That's okay.
You guys look alike too, even. Young, beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
Coming back to your point, Wesley, I think this is really astonishing to hear that, because in a way the students, they don't learn about the real life, you see. So in a way, it's kind of something, maybe we would have to know a little bit more of the context right there if they want to challenge the students, maybe, I don't know. But, and it's also like connecting what you were saying, Davina, about like if we use Google in the classroom, of course we use it, you see, because you want to go like in the real life, the students should understand like the whole thing. And then of course you're going to have to know Reddit or like Twitter or whatever. So, but at the same one time, there's limits, you see, like to what you can teach and what you can know about. Another thing that I thought was very interesting was about the question about when students produce something. And Addison, she was talking right here that students should create something. And it reminded me, of course, like of Brené's book, like Create to Learn. But then I said to myself as well, she was saying students should produce something like long content. And I'm saying this takes really a lot of time. You see, it's not that you're just going to use it like this, like from one. And I said to myself, also like we populate like the internet today with so many things, and we produce and we share everything that but sometimes I have to think that this is maybe almost too fast that we are sharing things, because the internet, there's so many things out there that maybe should not be shared as well. So I said to myself that this, I don't know, how is that again possible? And to also like teach maybe the students, or like to tell them that not everything has to be shared, like, and yeah, so that was something very important for me also, like an aspect that made me think a little bit. I'm not sure if there are some reactions to that. No. Here we go.
I'm still kind of like.
Oh, so
go ahead. Oh, I was going to say I'm still kind of like thinking about like, do you let kids use Google in class? And I work in a one-to-one environment as well, and I mean I'm fairly confident that it happens pretty regularly. And sometimes I'll even say, well, you have the computer right in front of you, why don't you check out what I said is true, you know? And so they like they definitely do use it. But then like to come back to what Wes was saying, so it just reminds me, I've been reading this John Franklin text. You know, he's like the first Pulitzer Prize winner for a feature article, and it's about writing. And he brought up this term called English teacher's revenge. And being an English teacher, I sort of chuckled to myself. But what he gets at is like there's a lot of sort of cultural practices with English teachers sometimes that like seem a little old-fashioned, and they may have had really good intent at first. And he was really specifically talking about like how to outline and how he comes across, and he wrote this book like in the 80s, I think. And he was talking about how students will come to his university classrooms, they have no idea how to outline anything. Or if they do, it has this very, very rigid structure that they had drilled into them. And so I think one of the things, like, I think it really is about relevance, like you said, because one of the challenges is if you teach English, you're really teaching sort of communication on some level, right? Like fundamentally. And so you ideally, this is a fight I have. I mean, I know we're recording this and it's going to be public, but I'm pretty on record about trying to advocate that, you know, we ask students to write things that we expect to be read, and not just always have writing that is like, you know, based on some kind of an assessment. And I think the danger that you run into, which is like kind of come up in the chat with regards to plagiarism and things like that, is that there's this sort of really narrow purpose often for the communication that we ask students to produce. And in that narrowness, we kind of lose sight of the bigger picture. And that narrowness can also sort of invite, or maybe a better way to say it would be like trigger a sort of protectionist kind of point of view, because you can control this little narrow sliver. And, you know, when people like kind of feel like they're not in control, they start to get nervous, right? So I think that's part of what goes on as well. But it made me kind of laugh, because I immediately was thinking of this book.
That seems like a spot on interpretation of the English teachers I've encountered. But I think in the world of English education in K-12, there's like a tension between the folks who see their work as communication, essentially, and folks who see their work as really about values and identity. Because you read Mark Twain in America, they don't read it in England. They don't read it in Paris. They don't read it in France, right? You read a set of core canonical texts because it's about identity and values. And that's where English teachers have this big problem with the stupid, heinous, awful values that they see in pop culture and the good values that they see in literature. Right? And I agree with you that control is part of comfort, and control are dynamics there. But I am a little bit sensitive to the protectionists who recognize that the values of pop culture are often fucked up, right? I have some respect for that.
I had a question right here for Fred. I'm not sure if but so when students produce something right here, so you're saying that it should be like for a wider audience, so that's like important for you. Is that the point that you're making?
Kind of. I mean, I guess the larger point that I would make is that in my experience, we ask students to say like write. If we just focus on writing for a second, we ask them to write quite a bit, actually. I would even argue that we ask students to write now more than ever. But the kind of writing that we ask them to do is almost always predicated on some kind of assessment. So it's really designed to be read by a teacher to determine whether you know anything about whatever it is that you're writing about. It also tends to be reward a kind of formulaic, very dogmatic approach. And what I would argue is, and then we wonder why the kids don't want to write anything ever, you know? But like, if you felt like you were only ever producing work that was going to be assessed and judged, like you wouldn't want to do it either, right? So the idea to me is that we need to ask kids to produce work that is designed to be consumed by a wider audience, whether that's, you know, even just within the classroom or beyond the classroom at times. It doesn't have to be all the time, because of course, when you're learning, you don't want your learning to always be public, right? Especially when you're not very good at something. You don't want like everybody to know that, oh, I'm really struggling with this thing, especially when you're young. So I get that, but you do want to like sort of encourage them to like produce work that is designed to be experienced by more than a teacher, real people, because that's like the best feedback you can get. Because one of the things that I say to my students all the time is, what's the worst thing that anybody can do to work that you've written? And they always look at me kind of dumbstruck, and I just say, not read it. Right? Like, it's not even worth my time.
Yeah. Yeah. So for me, I very much agree with you. You see, it should not be. And I think in the podcast, she's talking about the classroom without borders, so beyond the classroom. And I like that idea, of course, like to be like a social activist, maybe also like in today's context. And to what extent do you also educate students to have, or like to dare to have that voice, to maybe to share something. And it reminds me also like of the Summer Institute, where we talked about the audience, talking about the audience, who's actually going to receive and consume like whatever students are producing. So yeah, so that's something.
I should probably mention too, I also teach journalism. So that like seriously influences me, but I didn't start out as a journalism teacher. I started out as an English teacher. I didn't necessarily have a journalism background, but I always had this feeling that that writing was a place that you could really get a lot of traction with students, because it's an area of need, and that we need to sort of expand. I mean, I'm a big like National Writing Project guy, which I don't think they have in France yet, but you know, that you're like, you write with purpose and with audience in mind. And I know that at higher levels, that's like a significant thing. And so sometimes I feel like, you know, at the secondary level, really rigid kind of dogmatic approaches, that's not really preparatory for what is going to be asked of these students at the university level.
We're coming somehow to an end. Yeah, Davina, come on.
I had a question. So by that logic, what Fred has mentioned, digital social media would be ideal because you're writing for a broader audience. It's not just for assessment. So say if I had a class and I created a blog for that class, and I invited my students to write on a particular subject every week on that blog, and I would like weave in assessment in terms of peer review. So you have to, for example, read the blog entries and comment on those entries for say 3 students, any kind of 3 students or whatever. And I mean, the blog is essentially open for anybody to read. So you could post it on your social media if you'd like. Versus, I was also thinking of Luddite schools. So schools which philosophically position themselves as great, you have technology, you can use it at home, but in our school environment, we prefer that we do all teaching learning sans technology. I mean, I don't know, how would we then, because the child is going out into a digital social world. The risks are there. Are you sort of inoculating the child in the school environment without technology and then just leaving them to fend for themselves? I don't know. I mean, it's for everybody to discuss, not just one person.
I guess the way I would respond is by saying that there's always been a gap between the classroom and the culture. Like that's goes back 1,000 years or more than 1,000 years. So, and the nature of that gap is really interesting. Turns out in the history of universities, whenever the gap gets really large, these students rebel, right? They stop going to class like they did in Italy in the 1400s after the new books were available. The kids were like, fuck this, right? I don't need to, why don't I need to hear you lecture, right? And so university revolts sometimes happen when kids perceive that the gap between the classroom and the culture is too wide. I don't know that we have that situation in the United States right now, but it is interesting that it may be present, you know, in places around the world.
Well, and to think of it like that's another dimension of like the digital divide. Like it's not just access to hardware, but also access to opportunities to develop a professional voice or to tap into a professional community that will then lead to that summer internship or like whatever else that some kids are going to benefit from and some just aren't going to know how to navigate that.
That's a great point, Michelle. I like that, the way you phrased that, the other digital divide. Most of you know I visit high schools around Rhode Island, and the poorest city high schools have all the grants to bring in all of the one-to-one stuff that they need to do the best they can with their students while they have them in school. The wealthy private Catholic high school has nothing. They still have wooden desks. I'm surprised they're not still attached to the floor, but they definitely don't have technology or curriculum surrounding any kind of digital literacy or media literacy.
And then here we are. All of our students now are remote learning experiences, and not all of them have the kind of access or, Wi-Fi, all of these things. And we were talking about Sage on the Stage earlier, the traditional model school really was blown up this spring and everybody was in the same boat, but then you have that inequity too.
It's true, and I would also argue you have the inequity among teachers and professors and instructors, because some of us have taught online and some people are just, what in the heck is this online thing? I'm helping some of my fellow colleagues at Sonoma State get online and teaching in their little remote learning seminars. And it's nice because a lot of people are coming to it and saying, I had no idea, I'm really excited. I see now how maybe I can do this, not forever, but so it's nice that there's at least some of that sentiment, but Fawn, you make an excellent point. There's still the issue of, are we reaching all the students in this context, and how do we do that?
Have you guys had Zoom bombing issues? Because
I have not, but I know in India who have.
Yeah. We have these sad, funny videos on YouTube, which are essentially bits of pre-recorded Zoom classes, and the teachers are so endearing, so cute, poor guys. They're trying to figure out where a certain video is coming from or sound is coming from, and then the students are entering the class with certain funny names like names of porn stars and all that, and they're trying to figure out, and they're trying to announce your attendance is going to be marked, so please exit the class and sign in again with your real name and things like
Maybe
this.
Fingers crossed that there's no Zoom bombing today. I think there's only 3 minutes left. We don't want to tenter le diable, like you say in France. I think we're coming to an end. I thank you everybody for the rich conversation. We had like a little question with Samantha at the end, because we are planning the Media Club also in August, but so far I think we only had 2 or 3 replies for the August meeting. And I was wondering what the community, what do you think, if we should go for it or not? Because if most of us, we are away, also like in September, should we do it like at the beginning of September or maybe like more like mid-September, if that's right, Samantha, in a way to arrange things like when it would somehow would be best for everybody.
Yeah, so we basically just wanted to get an idea of who is in for August or who's overwhelmed in for August.
So we got many. So
Okay.
let's go for the August.
Okay, bye, Tina. Okay, how about September? Is it early September crazy for people or?
No, it's all good.
Okay, cool. Maybe Heather, okay. Okay, cool. We just wanted to kind of feel things out and everything. So we will keep going. You know what, why don't we keep the voting for the next title open for another week, just because we only had 2 responses. So I'll email out the link to vote for everybody. Or, you know, we've been doing this for 2 years now, and Michael and I are going to talk about changing up the format. If there's something that you guys really want to talk about, or a title that you really feel passionate about, why don't you email us, and maybe instead of voting on it, we'll just kind of let you have the floor.
So that's going to be something very nice. I put also the link into the chat box for the vote. And then thank you so much, everybody, for the conversation today. Thanks for speaking up. And everybody has a nice one in the United States. All the best to you guys.
And around the world.
And around the world. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Catching on.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.